Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Today's guest is the author of a new book warmly recommended to me by our own Mike Aquilina, host of our podcast, Way of the Fathers. And I'm glad he did, because this person turned out to be a very stimulating and congenial conversation partner. Brandon McGinley is the author of The Prodigal Church, Restoring Catholic Tradition in an Age of Deception. He argues that the Catholic Church in America has largely lost its distinctive flavor, and this goes back prior to Vatican II, at a time when in the early to mid-20th century, the Church in America, to be fully integrated and assimilated and accepted by the mainstream of American society, lost its savor and began instead emulating the spirit of the American bourgeois. When we recognize this, we can, instead of attempting to go back to some idealized previous era, or even continue the strategy that got us here, we can instead move forward in a creative way by embracing the spiritual realities that make the Catholic faith what it is. All of our podcasts here at CatholicCulture.org are supported by donations of listeners like you, so please consider helping us out by going to CatholicCulture.org/donate/audio. Brandon McGinley, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
You know, I never read books like this, and I never read the kind of like broad topic, how we can renew the church books. There's so many. They're always coming out and everybody has their own theory. So I just read this, honestly, because my friend Mike Aquilina vouched for it and recommended it. And what he said about it sounded more interesting. But a number of things put your book in my favor. When you said this is not a Vatican II book, I was like, okay, this is good. It's not a Benedict option book. It's not a Vatican II book. It's not an integralist book, I think. I could be wrong, but there's a little bit of that around the edges, maybe.
That depends if we're reading it esoterically or not.
right, exactly. Yeah. But you start the book with this introductory discussion of this famous talk that young Father Ratzinger gave. When was it? In the 80s? Early 80s?
1969. Yeah, this would have been...
okay, that early.
Yeah,
okay.
In the decade of the council, yeah.
Yeah, and the talk given for radio, I think you said, where he talked about, the future of the church being likely smaller and a more spiritual church. This is a quote you see often, and it's rarely parsed that much. I think it's just kind of like, at least I've seen it thrown out there more as a description of the consequences of where we're headed than as a kind of like a roadmap, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, so I know people use it as a catchphrase, and they use it to either kind of bash Benedict or to suggest that his vision is prophetic. And they especially use the phrase smaller and purer, which he never uses. He does say, as you said, more spiritual. And whether or not that progression, which is not something that he said should happen, but something that was going to happen and was in fact happening, whether we liked it or not, it's up to us whether that will be a purifying process. It doesn't have to be. There's nothing written into it that a, quote, more spiritual church is a purer church. It could be a spiritually weak and corrupted church just as much as it could be a materially corrupted church. And so that, for me, is the big takeaway from this. It's not that there's going to be some sort of, faithful remnant or something like that we should all of us who are practicing Catholics should just assume that we're part of that smaller and purer church. No, we need to see this as both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because there is something good about the church having a culture all around it. Cultural Catholicism is not necessarily bad. It becomes so when it becomes a culture to the exclusion or to the corruption of the spiritual, of the sacramental, of the liturgical. So it is a challenge because the church at her best is like that. The church at her best is all-encompassing, is creating and sustaining an integrated culture. But at a time when that is collapsing, again, not necessarily because of any particular set of actions or because, and Benedict was not suggesting this is something that we should hope to happen, but it is by virtue of the nature of the secular Western order, secular liberal Western order. This is what's happening. Question then becomes, how do we respond to this? How do we respond to the loss of worldly respect, the loss of worldly institutions, the loss of all of this? And the case that I make is that we, especially in the US, became so attached to being in the mainstream, having made it culturally and politically in terms of John F. Kennedy, in terms of culturally in the 1950s and the 40s, you have Bing Crosby winning Oscars for playing Catholic priests on the silver screen, and the Hays Code was basically written by and for Catholics and things like that. There's nothing wrong with having Catholic politicians in a Catholic-infused culture, but when those things become detached from reality, the spiritual reality, become detached from the reality of the church and of grace and the sacraments, when you have a Catholic politician who says quite publicly that he is doffing his Catholicism at the door of the White House, then you have a situation where all of these things that could be theoretically good, in fact, become corrupting. And when you get used to being in the mainstream and the mainstream shifts, then you have to step out. And we have not been good about doing that.
Yeah, I suppose the Catholic political machine, when it reached a certain height, sort of did the same thing as the black political machine did to Black Americans in selling them out in many respects.
Everyone thinks that it's just normal that like mainstream Democratic African American political figures would be pro-choice, but Jesse Jackson was outspokenly pro-life until he ran for president.
That's right.
And so, the process that we have undergone in terms of having our kind of distinctiveness and arguably radicalness, the radicalness of the Catholic vision muted, is not unique to us. It's particularly frustrating to see in non-heavenly institutions have gone through the same thing and we haven't been able to escape it. But I think I talk in the book about how, back in the 60s and 70s, the LGBT community, it was much more radical in its vision, and precisely for that reason created some often very long-lasting institutions in communities and neighborhoods around them. There's a lot of debate right now within that community about what does it mean to now be completely mainstream, to have won on the terms of the Democratic Party and to have won on the terms of kind of quote-unquote, bourgeois American morality. And, that idea of a distinctiveness and a radicalness being muted by a certain kind of success, it's something that any sort of community that has experienced any kind of marginalization goes through. And the funny thing with us, is that, we just in the moment we succeeded, the culture turned against us, but we still went along with it far too often because we didn't want to lose what we had gained in terms of respect and kind of that American mainstream.
Well, in the absence of a strong Catholic culture, even in the absence of a strong liturgical culture in the church, or, a lack of Catholic communities in a visible way, going back to that spiritual thing, it can be kind of like being a soul without a body and awaiting the general resurrection, as a Catholic trying to really live out the faith right now. Because so many of the normal, aside from like sort of the core of what the sacraments are themselves, the core of what the church hierarchy is, the full flowering of those things, the external manifestations are largely missing in many places.
Something that I'm pretty sure I talk about in the book, and it's something that I think about a lot, is how the Catholic faith is so corporeal. It's so invested in embodiedness. You see this in the sacraments, of course, in the Eucharist as kind of paramount among them. But you see this also in, the emphasis on the corporal works of mercy, on the emphasis on liturgy, on the emphasis on that kind of acts of service that are embodied, that are actually being present to somebody, and then the own presence, of course, of the Lord in a physical way. And so this goes to, that idea, like I said before, of cultural Catholicism. It's not necessarily bad. A Catholic culture is not bad. Now, again, when Catholicism becomes cultural primarily, that's where the problem is. But You said at the beginning of our discussion that, all the things the book isn't a Vatican II book. It's not an integralist book. It's not a, whatever other options there are. And that was very intentional. I did not want you to be able to read this thing and say, oh, this is an anti-cultural Catholicism book. This is a pro-traditionalist book. Whatever buzz phrases and groups or partisan, agglomerations you can think of. It's not meant to be anything like that. So at the same time that we say that the corruption of kind of integrated Catholicism into a purely cultural thing was bad, we have to also affirm that the church is a culture building thing. It's a culture building, not just institution, it's a culture building reality. That's part of a great deal of what the church does and has done. And part of the reason for that is, of course, metaphysical, and that's simply what the church is. But also, the Catholic Church is not meant to be the kind of thing where only people who can, access and read and integrate into their psyches the works of St. Thomas Aquinas or John Henry Newman or something like that, or some other great saint can access. The church is, in a true sense, now we're getting a little cliche, but the church is small c Catholic. It's universal. It's for everybody. It's for the grandmother who has maybe, never heard of John Henry Newman, but knows how to pray the rosary and knows how to get to Mass, and that's it, and that's enough. And having a culture that sustains that kind of faith is part of what it means to be Catholic. That's part of what it means to be the church. And so, some of the vision of the book then is not to say, oh, we need to get away from cultural Catholicism, but to say, what are the baby steps we can be making right now to rebuild that, to rebuild a Catholic culture? And for me, that begins with what I consider to be both the foundation of renewal and its keystone, which is friendship and community. It's not just the nuclear family. It's not even just the extended family, but it's almost the new version of the extended family, a new version of the clan that's not necessarily defined by blood in the biological sense, but it's defined by the blood of Christ. It's defined by our shared relationship in the church. And then getting back to that embodiedness has a manifestation in the local, manifested in acts of service, acts of hospitality, acts of living together that get us accustomed, that form habits of hospitality, habits of grace. And that is where, for me, the most exciting things happening in the church are right now in little neighborhoods and communities like that.
There's a couple of remarks in the book, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but, just to touch on the kind of the integralist thing, crypto-integralism of the book. There's a couple of remarks about American principles being incompatible with Catholic principles. I'm just sort of curious, what do you mean when you say American principles? Do you mean in the sense of kind of like how they are lived, or kind of like the principles like sort of implicit in our culture? Or do you mean like the actual founding sort of constitutional principles of our country?
So, yeah, the question of American principles then, you can be taken in a few ways, I guess. But I think that question of whether the American founding set us on the trajectory to kind of aggressive, secular, progressive liberalism is interesting. And I lean towards the affirmative, but I don't feel like we need to really litigate that, because the fact of the matter is that here we are. And there's no going back. And that's important. That's an important thing that I talk about throughout the book. There's no going back. There's no going back to the Middle Ages. There's no going back to a Christianized liberalism in 1776 or whatever other time period you want. There's no going back to the 1950s. There's no going back. Because, and here I agree with Patrick Deneen, that liberalism requires a substrate. Liberalism requires something that it layers on top of. And in the 18th century, that was a Protestant Christian culture in this country. It was not a secular culture. It was a Christian culture. And of course, then, Deneen would argue that liberalism necessarily consumes its own substrate and leaves itself with nothing. And that is intuitively, I like that. But we don't, again, have to affirm his argument to say that the substrate has, in fact, been devoured. We don't have to say it was necessarily going to happen, to say that it has happened. And there is no substrate left. There's not enough left of Christian culture for American principles to have any sort of firm foundation in our age. So to the extent that I am saying that we need to detach ourselves from American principles. I'm not saying we need to become raging anti-Americans. We don't need to be spitting at the flag or anything like that. We still need to be pious in the sense of the virtue of piety, a kind of patriotism. But we don't have to be pious. We don't have to be patriotic on the terms that are offered to us by our country. That would have some rather perverse implications for people in places like Nazi Germany or even communist China or any other number of places. We don't have to love our country for the reasons our country tells us to. We can love our country for many, many other reasons. I love bluegrass music. I love the culture and the people of Appalachia. I love lots of things about America. And I love lots of things what America has done and continues to do. But we don't have to go all in on any kind of a version of liberalism or certainly secularism or individualism or any sort of pioneer spirit. You can say there were some good things there, but at the end of the day, individualism is corrosive. Not just in practice is it corrosive of faith and morals, but in its very metaphysical, anthropological underpinnings is corrosive of the faith.
Okay, so yeah, the reason I asked is I'm kind of interested in this question of patriotism right now, and it seems like part of what we're experiencing at the moment is a crisis of patriotism, even if that's not, the root of it, especially the events of the past couple of months. For that reason, I just started reading Robert Riley's book. One thing that I'm a little uneasy with is this idea of America as a propositional nation. I realize that that's partially true. But part of me wonders, we don't have to go into this, but it's just interesting. Part of me wonders, if the very idea of a propositional nation is not liberal in character. Okay, is a nation like an ideology? At the very least, that can, as you say, that can't be all that there is to being an American. What you believe can't be all that there is. And there's an American community that precedes the founding,
Yes. Yeah, and I gestured to this in a few places in my answer just now. I talked about, that substrate, which is the culture on which the founding was layered, but also, the things that stir up, not that patriotism or piety certainly is only about feelings, but the things that stir up those feelings now aren't so much like patriotic songs as they are things like, listening to distinctively American music in the good sense, listening or appreciating distinctively American art. There's a lot of beauty. There's a lot of beauty in this place, geologically and geographically, and in terms of what human beings have created here. And, it's funny that you brought up the propositional nation thing, because years ago I wrote a short essay on this where I argued that that's not sufficient. I think that there is something distinctively propositional about America, but that cannot be the whole thing. It just doesn't make sense. It is also a group of people who live in a particular place in a particular time and have generated stories and generated a culture. Now, going to that proposition, America is a distinctively diverse and distinctively welcoming and distinctively heterogeneous version of that. And I think that's good. I think that's very good. But our takeaway from that should not be that anything goes. And that's where things kind of go off the rails, where we become indifferentists, where we say that the good things in that heterogeneous nature of what America is also includes everybody going whatever way they want in terms of religion. Religion, importantly, not just being a sociological or psychological category where there are several different religions, but no, religion as a virtue, religion as the virtue by which we do justice to God. And in that way, there can be diversity of spiritualities, but there cannot be diversity in terms of how well we pursue that justice, how well we live out that justice, both individually and corporately. That's not a good thing. And so, I think we can say that there's a lot of good in the way that America understands herself and has lived out that self-understanding, while also saying that taking that to the point of indifferentism, taking that to and this is Pope Leo's, argument in his letter to the American bishops, but we can't take that to the point where everything is thrown up into the air, where all forms of difference are considered to be good difference. And that's just not true.
Let's go back briefly to the stuff about the 1950s. You mentioned some of the reasons that Catholics would have had to be optimistic in the 50s after a long period of hostility from American society towards Catholics, and particularly towards Catholic immigrants in the 19th century. They seem to have finally made it into the American mainstream, especially, as you say, in Hollywood, which was very, in many ways, shaped by Catholicism for a certain period of time. You also mentioned, I think, JFK as sort of like the ultimate kind of failure of that, with success, kind of a failure inherent in the success of that. I think in debates over traditionalism and liturgy and things like that, I think one thing that's often missing is a sense of what things were actually like before the council. Something my dad can sometimes speaks to because, he was around as a young man before that. But you do get into this in the book. So can you just give a few indications of, problems in the Catholic Church or problems in Catholicism's relation to the mainstream culture prior to the council?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I opened the first chapter of the book with a description of a bulletin that was re-released for the anniversary of a local parish. Bulletins from the 1950s, they were re-releasing. And there was something like 10 or 12 weekend masses. It was tons of apostolates and sodalities and institutions and so on. And in many ways, the portrait of what a thriving parish should look like. But I've also spoken with enough people who were around then to know that at a certain point, when you have masses at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, whatever hours of the day they were, at a certain point, it becomes something of a sacramental factory, which is nothing wrong with. I mean, there's something charming, of course, about this idea of a kind of sacramental machine that's just churning out sacraments. It's just, churning out engraced people out into the streets. But at the same time, when you have, masses at, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock, these are not the kind of very liturgically precise and necessarily, liturgies that you see today in many, Latin Mass communities. This is very much, as was once described to me by a priest of the Diocese of Pittsburgh, get them in, get them out, get them going. This is, like I said, it's almost an industrial production of sacraments, which, like I said, is not intrinsically bad, but at a certain point, the thing becomes rote. At a certain point, it becomes the thing that you do on Sundays because that's what everyone else does on Sundays, and not the thing that you do on Sundays because it is a sacred obligation and a sacred act of love for the Holy Trinity. I think a lot of story my dad tells about how, in his Catholic neighborhood in Pittsburgh in that era, the social event of the season was Christmas midnight mass, when all the boys, the high school boys, would ask girls to go with them, and they would get corsages and get all dressed up and the whole 9 yards. That was the thing everyone did. And again, on the one hand, you're like, how beautiful that the liturgy becomes a social event. It's the church, the parish is truly the center of life. On the other hand, when it gets to the point where Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament is just one more guest at this party, when the liturgical becomes incidental to the social, that's when you have the seeds of a demise that's going to happen the moment it becomes difficult to keep that culture up. And that is what happened. And so Fulton Sheen talked about how the spirit of the bourgeois had infiltrated American Catholicism, how going to Mass had become the thing that respectable people did. And then when what is respectable changes, at the same time that the communities that sustained that way of life in places like the neighborhoods of Pittsburgh were emptying out into the suburbs, and it became much more difficult from a purely logistical point of view to sustain that way of life. And all of a sudden, people's attentions are being pulled in different ways, and you have to make an active decision to get out on Sundays or some other day of the week to attend a parish function. You have to get in the car, and it's a 10, 15, 20, 30-minute drive instead of a 5-minute walk. This begins to demonstrate that the whole thing, and not just because of any sort of confusion or whatever comes out of the Second Vatican Council, but because the whole thing is built on a way of living, broadly speaking, that was passing away. And it turned out that when that way of living passed away, the sacramental, which had been de-emphasized, not necessarily intentionally, but in the way it was lived, sacramental turned out not to be enough to sustain it.
So what happens as the church, the church has been accepted into mainstream culture to a large degree while still having an outward distinctiveness, even if perhaps it was embracing a worldly spirit, lay people and clergy were embracing a worldly spirit. In some respects, there was still, and this is why the traditionalists, some of them, I'm sure it's a caricature of traditionalists to say they want to go back to 1950s, but let's say like the vulgar kind of like the ones who reinforce this stereotype of just wanting to go back to some ideal era. That's one reason they like this previous era in American cultures because that external distinctiveness was still present. But now then, as the culture moves in a different direction, then, as you say, the church hierarchy and lay people, of course, starts wanting to maintain that comfortable position in American society or in Western society. And, as much as we can talk about, and this is a kind of an issue your book sidesteps, and I think justifiably so, the issue of like kind of actual malice among, say, some of the council fathers or more of a diabolical agenda. The fact is that none of these things ever really catch on without fear of human respect. I think that's typical of our moment.
Yeah. I talk about the old essay that has formed a lot of my thinking on this stuff. The old essay by Christopher Dawson on Catholicism and the bourgeois mind. And he identifies, and I think rightly so, truly traditional Catholic culture as being anti-bourgeois. It is not interested in accumulation of material goods for worldly ends, is not interested in a kind of an obsession with pragmatism. It is not interested in keeping up appearances. And you see this in a very anti-bourgeois sentiment. In fact, I mentioned in the book, kind of offhand, but I think it's something I really want to explore more at some point, that a certain amount of the anti-Catholicism in American culture, that clash was not so much theological. I think it's in part theological because there's that fear, of course, of obedience to the Pope and that it's anti-American and all that. And I don't think it's necessarily unjustified, but a lot of it is a culture clash between a staid bourgeois Protestantism and an often ecstatic and chaotic and sometimes a little dingy Catholicism. The teeming urban enclaves that Hollywood wanted to make sure we're happy to go see movies, that's why you get the Hays Code, are also seen as culturally threatening to kind of established waspiness. And so if we're talking about any sort of infiltration, I think that the infiltration of the spirit of the bourgeois fits the data better than communists or whatever else the case may be. And like you said, it can also help to explain how certain things took hold in the church that might not have in a previous era. So I think that the data is really fit best by this idea that we became wasps.
You talk about the church losing her distinctiveness in American culture. And, it's easy to point to sort of the changes in the liturgy as a manifestation of that, or the failure of, bishops and priests and lay people to preach distinctively Catholic teachings. But there's also, just on the level of kind of practice and spirit, kind of a flattening, a losing of the savor. And this is something that people have talked about with, the whole like make Catholicism weird again kind of Ross Douthat thing. I think that was him. But you have a great example of this. I'd love you to recapitulate here in the book of this Catholic Social Services Gala that you went to that provides a really great example of this.
Yeah, it's an event I'm familiar with, that was held on a Friday, and all of the important people, not only from the diocese, but from, the local, philanthropic people, they were all there. It's a kind of event where, like, at the end of the week, it appears in the fashion section or the scene section of the Sunday paper in your city. It's like, so-and-so was seen wearing so-and-so was seen with so-and-so, and all that kind of thing. And it's for a Catholic social services organization. On the one hand, how cool, this is like so mainstream that it's like one of the big events of the season. But it's held on a Friday, and, and clergy are there and the bishop's there. And, they're serving filet mignon or whatever, and everyone gets served a big plate of meat in front of them. There's no sign whatsoever that any sort of dispensation from the typical Friday abstinence has been given by the local ordinary. I know that it's officially not a rule in the USCCB, et cetera, but galas are not penitential. The whole idea of removing Friday abstinence was that, everyone will be able to figure out some other way that suits them to make Friday into a penitential day. But then when big Catholic organizations are throwing big parties on Fridays, it just kind of puts the lie to that. It makes it look like, and maybe because we don't actually care, that all these little things that built up Catholic culture, these little things that not only build up a kind of cultural distinctiveness, but build up a spiritual distinctiveness. That, for me, one of the best spiritual practices I took on was making Fridays more and more penitential within reason in my state in life, and then adding a little bit of a celebratory aspect to Sunday so that every week has a little bit of an arc to it. Every week terminates in a little triduum. That's what it's supposed to be. And then when our big public organizations, with the apparent, more than toleration, with the apparent acceptance and so on of the local ordinary and so on, are throwing big parties on Fridays with filet mignon and so on, you could serve salmon. I mean, salmon's not even that penitential, but at least it makes it look like we care a little bit about Fridays and about the passion and about the idea of that's just baked into Catholicism. It goes back to that corporeality that we've talked about, that embodiedness, that these actions matter, that we live out the reality of Christ's passion in some little ways in the actions we take throughout the year. This to me is basic. And so when you have that and you have, bland evocations of the work that organization does with no sense whatsoever that it's actually a Catholic organization, except that there are a few Roman collars in the room, it's just disheartening and dispiriting because, what we have to offer is so much more than this. And, this is not a cranky book. This is not a cranky book that I wrote. It's not an anti-bishops book. It's not an maybe an anti-boomer book, but that's, but it's not a cranky piece of work. And so, tell that story to make the point that, we need to remember that even in the little things, like when we schedule our big fancy galas, that we are witnessing in some small way to the reality of the cross. And when we're doing big bashes on Fridays, even not in Lent, it just looks like we don't care. It just looks like we're just like anybody else. And it's like I said, it's dispiriting. And maybe there's some data out there that galas held on Fridays generate 5% more income than any other day. But you know what? Put it on a Saturday, put it on a Thursday, and you know what? Trust that God will make up the difference. That, for me, is just little acts of trust, little acts of faithfulness, little acts of piety that become habits, personally and institutionally, and we get used to them, and that's good. But then when you start to break those habits and you start to get into the habit of doing things as if Fridays don't matter, as if all the little things don't matter, well, that forms habits too. And those are bad habits. And they're habits that can be really hard to imagine what it's like on the other side of. There are a few things that I'll say, if there's one thing you take away from the book, it's this, but this is one of them. Habits matter. And forming little habits in family life and in the life of friendship, in the life of community, those can be those little acts of defiance against secular liberalism and against a kind of indifferentism and against a graceless world where we're doomed to be sinners forever. Those little acts of defiance build up into habits of defiance that become big acts of defiance. That's what virtue is all about. And that applies individually as well as in families and in friendships and in parishes and in dioceses.
Okay, well, let's talk about, unpleasant as it may be, let's talk about the bishops, specifically about the present feeling that the faithful laity have towards the church hierarchy, especially at the episcopal level. There's the Fulton Sheen quote, which I'm sure you know about, how, it's our job as lay people to make sure that the priests act like priests and the bishops act like bishops. I feel like that's easy to misunderstand. And I'm not sure that I totally understand exactly what it should look like in practice. But what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think it's certainly not something I would take in the sense that, we're supposed to become like lobbyists. Like back when I was in a previous life, I worked for a pro-life, pro-family public policy organization, and we were encouraging people. The idea was to encourage every social conservative Christian in Pennsylvania to become basically a lobbyist who is emailing and calling their representatives and so on. That's not the relationship we have to our priests and bishops. We don't have a relationship to our priests and bishops like we do to our elected representatives. That's a completely different kind of relationship. The other thing I would say is that, very distinctively remember a homily was given by one of our priests at my parish, and it was just, I took it to be, frankly, a really hopeful thing, although not so hopeful for bishops, that the lay people are not going to be judged by the administration of the church. Bishops will be judged by the administration of the church. And so that doesn't mean that we just become passive. But it doesn't mean that we don't get ourselves worked up over things that are not, at the end of the day, our ecclesial or frankly even moral responsibility. Now, this gets into difficult territory when you're talking about things like actual criminal acts, both canonical and civil, when we're talking about the abuse crisis and things like that. The abuse crisis doesn't just happen because a bunch of clerics get together and say they're going to cover things up. A bunch of lay people said, yes, we're going to help you. So it's not like that you turn a blind eye to actual crimes, like I said, canonical or civil. But I think that, it is incumbent on lay people to, most important parts about being a lay person in the Catholic Church. Certainly, I'm a father of four, and, as a leader in a family, is to organize your life in the life of those whose lives you have any sort of authority over around getting to heaven, around pursuing the life of virtue, the life of holiness as well as possible. And just doing that, I think, has an impact on the way dioceses and parishes are run. And there are times where the best thing you can do is to stick with a parish that's struggling. But there are times also where the best thing you can do is to say, I'm going to go somewhere that is going to be better spiritually for me and my family. And so sometimes it's just as simple as that. Not taking a consumeristic approach, but taking a holistic, integrated approach to the spiritual life. Simply things like that, just saying that, like, I'm going to prioritize my salvation. And bishops and priests, seeing that, will act differently. When the median layperson is not acting in that way, when the median layperson is acting in terms of, maximizing respect or maximizing respectability or maximizing their pocketbook or whatever, then for better or for worse, there's going to be a response to that. And so simply all of us pursuing holiness in our own states in life, that for me is I guess, priority number one when it comes to ensuring that the hierarchy performs its tasks. And I know, the church has a long and glorious history of laity not liking their priests and their bishops and everyone in between. I don't mean that we all have to become pathetically, parroting the PR lines that are coming down from the chancery. No, I don't mean that at all. But I also think that the injunction that we should have, the idea that we should take any sort of special responsibility for the work of priests and bishops begins with us taking responsibility for ourselves and letting the example of what the faithful are doing inform what priests and bishops are doing rather than haranguing them.
So, yeah, we don't want to be naive, but it seems like complaining constantly on social media about the bishop is really not going to solve anything.
It doesn't move the ball. It doesn't move the ball at all. And I'm really tired of it, because not only do I think that it is corrosive to piety in the sense of the individual, I think that it is corrosive to piety in the sense of everybody who's reading it, because I've just seen too much anger. And I know the irascible appetite is a real and good thing. We're supposed to become upset over injustice, social injustice, and ecclesial spiritual injustice. Foremost form of which is irreligion. There's often a lack of piety and a lack of virtue and a lack of a lot of things in the institutional church. But I think that we can be tempted. Don't get me wrong, the abuse crisis is a world historical example of this. But I think the idea that we are led by a bunch of knaves and fools and cowards right now at this particular moment is, there's almost a certain pridefulness in it, as if this moment is so much worse than every other moment in church history. But the church has always been led by knaves. That's the Belloc line, about any worldly institution that was, ordered with such knavish imbecility would have collapsed within a fortnight, and just constantly becoming upset about it. I really have trouble understanding. I know some people have a fuller expression of the irascible appetite in their personalities than I do, but it's really hard for me to see how that moves the ball personally or ecclesially. What bishops see that moves them, what a bishop who's really doing the work, who really wants to do right by his people, and more often than not they are, even as there are lots of counterexamples, what is going to move them is seeing the faithful do things that inspire them to create the conditions in their dioceses to make more of that possible. I know we often feel like we're fighting an uphill battle, and there is the reality of politicking and getting involved in councils and, I was on a committee, I've been on several committees and things like that. but, I really don't think kind of a constant anger that acts like, we're somehow uniquely poorly led. I don't think it helps.
What I've seen with some people is often, some of the people who in some ways are most perceptive about seeing even the little ways in which our bishops fail us and have kind of like a laser focus on those things is a certain level of maybe not despair, but despondency about the situation in the church, to the point where, yeah, as you say, it almost starts to extend to the church itself and not just to the bishops, at least in a practical level. And I think I understand it because we've been so... One thing that I find disturbing is to see where even the bishops who are held up as kind of like the icons of, and we don't have to get into details, the kind of like the icons of like good Orthodox faithful bishops, when you see that they have even failed us in major ways, in many or most cases, that can be discouraging. You say something really important in the book, and that is that we need to remember that the church is not just destined for holiness, but the church is holy in the present. And a lot of this has to do with remembering that the church is not just what we see here on earth. It's also the church triumphant. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. One of the hardest chapters for me to write was the whole part of the book, 2 chapters on the church. And one's called the visible church, and one's called the invisible church. The visible church, that was a hard chapter to write because for precisely all the reasons we're talking about. Because, I don't want people to come away from this book more angry than when they left. I want people to understand that the role of the bishop is very, very difficult. St. John Chrysostom has an incredible letter about this that I quote extensively in the book. We should pray for them. But more fun to write, because I think it's more important, frankly, in this particular moment, and because it's so easily forgotten and we just don't talk about it, is the invisible church. That the church is right now the saints in heaven. Right now, as we speak, they are in a sense more members of the church than we are. They are enjoying the beatific vision right now and forever. I mean, this for me, you could kind of, throw yourself even further despair. It's like, oh, the earthly institution is just so much doesn't live up to it. But that's not the point. The point is not that the earthly institution is supposed to become the heavenly institution right now. No. The point is that we have the heavenly church, the church triumphant, right now. It is here. It is just as real, if not more so, than you or me. And than any number of bishops or cardinals or so on. That was really essential to me writing a book that is a hopeful book, a hope-filled book. That the moments of renewal and the experiences of renewal that we have seen in the church through the centuries have rarely been through, not that they've never been through, but rarely been through savvy politicking in the church. They've been through faithfulness to the church triumphant and letting the church triumphant be heaven on earth right now. So that for me is really, really important.
I have to apologize to any listeners if there's sounds of rain, possibly hail, and thunder hitting my air conditioning unit. Well, the thunder's not hitting my air conditioning unit, but in the window right next to where I'm sitting, we've got a pretty loud storm going on right now, and I'm not sure how much I'll be able to edit that out of my remarks. Let's go ahead and talk about the parish. There's this sociological concept of third places that you discuss, and it's a good place to start because basically it's the idea that the first place would be the home, the second place would be the place of work, and the third place are those community spaces that are easily accessible to people, kind of the agora, the marketplace, where people meet, different kinds of people interact, and you have the genuine possibility of a community. And I think, although you certainly talk about the family quite a bit, it does seem like a lot of the heart of the book is more about these places where people from different parishes meet, so that we have this kind of matrix of Catholics, and not just of Catholics, but of people in general.
The idea of the third place is really important, and it's important in, kind of modern urbanism and so on. And the idea of a place where serendipity can happen, where you just run into somebody, and then running into somebody in a coffee shop becomes having them and their family over for hot dogs on the grill, and then, and that becomes a friendship. It's just, and I argue that, the parish can be that kind of place, the place where you aren't just spending 1 hour on Sundays. We're also going for, in fact, I think I mentioned in the book, like I wrote some of the book sitting in the old school cafeteria while my daughter was at a new scouting group at our parish, because on a Monday I was at my parish, and I have a meeting at my parish that may or may not end up being on Zoom, we'll see, next week. And so making the parish the kind of place where it is possible simply to be, yes, for the liturgical, and not just for Mass, for novenas, and for the Liturgy of the Hours, and for other, para-liturgical kinds of prayer, but then also for other social functions, or meetings for apostolates and other groups, and things like that. The parish as a place where you feel at home, in a real sense, and both in the kind of super theological abstracted sense of it being, the home of Jesus in the tabernacle and us feeling at home there, but also in the just the emotional sense that this is a place I feel home and safe. And then I argue that, to the extent that it's possible for parishes, and every parish is different, I totally understand that, and some have very limited resources, but to the extent that it's possible, the parish should be a place where anybody should feel safe and at home, a kind of sanctuary, where a homeless person or a displaced migrant or someone who's just fallen on hard times, parishioner or no, can know that they can ask for help and not be judged. It doesn't mean that every parish has to become a full-scale social service organization. I know that's not possible. But at the very least, a place where someone who doesn't have anywhere else to go can talk to somebody and be referred to somewhere to go. Ideally, it could be a place to go, but, it's not always possible. So, I think the idea of the parish as that third place that was de-emphasized, if not outright destroyed in suburbanization, that, part of the way we think about what the parish can be has to be a place where, the parish is the local instantiation of the church, and in that way, it's the local instantiation of the mediation of grace to a community. Part of that grace is being a place to be where that grace can be shared.
Right. I'm a big advocate of everybody going to daily mass because I just think, if there was a time when it wasn't necessary for serious growth in holiness, I think that time has passed, and same with the daily rosary, of course. But you were talking about, wouldn't it be great if it was just normal for people to come to church, to come to the parish at least once in the week, other than Sunday Mass, even possibly for a liturgical, even if it's not Mass, for Vespers or something like that. And, that might seem like a low bar to set, from a spiritual point of view, if not from a community point of view. But it seems to me that would be a great doorway for people to beginning to go to daily mass. Just the fact that you show up at the parish an evening, sometime during the week for some kind of activity where you're interacting with the priest and you're being, introduced to Catholicism as something that happens during the week, at the very least. I think that actually would be a great, as well as a good goal in itself for various reasons, it would be a great stepping stone, because not everybody is going to read a book or have a conversation with someone that gets them thinking, maybe I should start going to mass during the week every day. But, I think that if they're showing up for other reasons at the parish during the week, and if it is truly done in a Catholic spirit so that it's not just a social function with a thin Catholic veneer, if the priest is really intending it as an opportunity for evangelization, I think that could be a really great starting point.
Absolutely. It forms an integrated whole where, you got the classic, donuts after Mass, but donuts after Mass the social can then lead into the liturgical and vice versa. And you end up with a praying community. And a community in the full sense, not just a community of prayer, but a community where prayer is the foundation, both liturgical prayer and then, of course, bringing that into the home, prayer in the home. And I think that's the only way forward, frankly. I don't think there's no future in a way of doing parish life that is once a week on Sundays. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, people in different stages of life, an elderly person may not be able to make it to the parish more than once a week. That's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But one of the big points of the entire book is to try to shift the window of what's possible. And I want to think of this especially supernaturally in terms of grace, in terms of what grace makes possible. But in terms of the kind of engraced aspects of everyday life, I'm thinking about habits. I'm thinking about ways of living that seem extravagant or fanciful when you describe them right now. Like some people going to daily mass, be like, I could never go to daily mass every day. It's just not possible. I feel like that because I have 4 kids who are not uniquely bad at mass, but they're up there. And so, but I've had enough experiences to know that making a commitment to make a few small changes, like last Lent, I was like, you know what? We're buckling down. We're doing the rosary every day. And then after like 10 days of that, the 4-year-old was like, at the end of a day, when we got back from somewhere late, he said, we haven't done the rosary yet. I'm like, wow, this habit was formed for you in 10 days, and now you're guilting me, But that seemed extravagant because a 15-minute rosary with all these kids, and, how are we going to do this in a way that's respectful and blah, 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 One of the big points in the book is shifting what we think is possible, and that begins with habits, this little habits. So like for us, it was only 2 years ago that like a family rosary every day was something that seemed out of reach. And then at one point you're just like, okay, we're doing it. And after only a few weeks, it became normal. And now it is normal. And so that can happen with daily mass. That can happen with lots of things. That can happen so it happens in family life. It happens in the life of friends and communities. And it happens in parish life, where things that for a young or even an experienced pastor seem impossible or fanciful can, with the help of, and here's where we're getting into the laity, really, the importance of the laity being involved and being resourceful and so on. With the help of the laity, things that seem fanciful can become normal a lot faster than we think.
Let's move on to the family. Just because of time limitations, I'd like to focus in on, there's a lot of books about the family, and I'm a big advocate of the nuclear family. Actually, not in the sense that that's all there should be, but in the sense that that is the privilege, that is the only sacramentally established sort of form of the family. The grandfather is not the authority over the grandchildren. The father is. But you do talk about the family needing to be in relation to other families and in the larger communities. And you have personal experience of developing this way of life. So why don't you tell us about your experience in this?
Yeah, one of the things, speaking of shifting the window of what's possible, of what feels like it's possible, if you had told me even 5 or 6 years ago that I would have the neighborhood of young Catholic families and friendships that I have right now, I would have said, that's fanciful. That's a great idea, but I have no idea how to make that happen. And yet here we are with several families, at this point, at least 10 or so, within walking distance of one another with, 30, 40 kids altogether, probably more than 40 at this point. And that now for me is normal. But that didn't happen overnight. It happened with a combination of letting things happen and then taking action to make sure those things continue to happen. So a lot of it was just, we moved into this neighborhood, the second family of ones who we're closest with to move in. But we weren't moving into our neighborhood to form a community. It was just a nice bonus. We were going to be 3 blocks away from another family we knew. But then because there were 2, when other folks were looking into saying, oh, hey, it's time for us to move, our neighborhood moved up the list of neighborhoods that they were considering. It wasn't, we're going to form a community. It was, this now makes this neighborhood a little bit more appealing. And then you had 3 or 4 families, and then people started to actually push up their timelines for new houses. And then you start to really have something going. And it began with us just saying, we see each other a lot in church functions, and our kids are a similar age. We're in similar activities. We should prioritize these friendships. It was as simple as that, really. And that prioritization, that recognition that we were forming something of an extended family, as with most people, a lot of the families who we're close with here in our neighborhood are either away from their families of origin geographically or spiritually, and sometimes even more dramatically. And so we have formed something of an extended family, something of a clan. And that for me has been an incredible blessing. The kinds of easy hospitality and intimacy that this has made possible, and that are then reinforced precisely by those actions. So, I think I mentioned in the book how the first time I felt like I had really close friends the way I had them in college was when I came back from a dinner I was at, expecting to come into my home with my wife and I think then 2, maybe 3 kids. And it turned out 3 or 4 other families were in the house, and she had served everybody tacos. And I was met by a wall of sound, children and adults talking in my own house. But my immediate reaction wasn't surprise or anger. It was, I feel immediately at home with these people. This is wonderful. And it felt for the first time like that feeling of intimacy you have whenever, meet people in their rooms in college, in their dorm rooms or whatever. So you had that feeling of intimacy, that feeling of comfort that these are my people and that I can joke with them and have serious conversations with them that I hadn't had in a very long time. And so it's a combination then of letting the work of grace continue to form those relationships, and when the moments call for it, making active decisions to live closer together, or to forgive, of course, or to forego some sort of confrontation that you feel like there's just little things that add up into habits of grace.
The family is the domestic church, of course. And, we wanted to talk about restoring Catholic culture. I think that would be a huge thing to focus on. And the only reason I don't is because I've already covered it to some extent recently on the podcast, and because we have limited time. But, one of my recent guests referred to the home as like being sort of like a cloister, it should be like a cloister. But, one of the interesting things about, a monastery, we associate it with seclusion and with, being separated from the world. But it's also traditionally known for being a place of great hospitality. And I really do think that hospitality of the family is very, very important for evangelization and for supporting other Catholics. Of course, people talk about, single Catholics needing to have families that they're friends with, to visit with, and things like that. But I found it very impactful for me, going into... I visited in Catholic homes that were not very Catholic, that were places of discord and kind of disturbing to be in. And I've been in Catholic homes that were also very peaceful and where I felt like I was part of the family when I was there. And, I see the father blessing his wife and children before they go to bed. And those things are really powerful to witness. And I think that maybe more than anything else, those experiences give you the sense that, okay, this is a life that is actually possible. I think that has to be the case for non-believers as well. The experience of friendship is very important, but, unless non-believers are coming to Mass, they're not going to probably get too many opportunities to see how Catholics interact with each other and how they live each other. And if you're a non-believer who just has the experience of having a good Catholic friend, you can see how that Catholic friend treats you with love or others with love. But there is a difference between the way that a Catholic relates to non-Catholics and the way he relates to his brethren in Christ. And I think it is very valuable for non-Catholics to be able to sit in on that and actually see and be included in the familial love of a Catholic family.
Absolutely. I love the way you talk about, you mentioned peace. That's something I talk about a lot in the book, and how peace is not just the absence of discord or the absence of conflict. Any home with more than one child has children who are in conflict with one another. That doesn't mean it's not a place of peace, though. Peace is mostly about the presence of justice, the presence of a kind of harmony that isn't necessarily reflected in a kind of weird stasis at every moment. In fact, peace is dynamic. Peace is about blessing your family at bedtime, especially after a day when everyone's had a hard day of bickering and discord and stealing each other's, Hot Wheels and so on, And so I think it's important when you think of hospitality. Hospitality is not putting on a show. Hospitality is truly welcoming. Hospitality doesn't mean that I've written about this, but I'm still not the best at it. I still get jumpy when new people come into my house and it's not perfect, because it's never perfect. Or when the kids are being normally chaotic, but when someone else is seeing it, I feel like they're being extraordinarily chaotic. Things like that for a person who is truly a person of goodwill is going to be not fazed by this. Maybe surprised if they're not used to children, but they're not going to think that things are bad or whatever. But but hospitality, though, is, like I said, it's not about entertaining or creating a kind of Potemkin, perfection. That's the normal way of hospitality. The Catholic way of hospitality, the Christian way of hospitality, is more vulnerable and more frightening, because it does involve allowing people into a situation that, while if not spiritually completely in order, is trying desperately to be spiritually in order, even if it's not necessarily materially in order at that particular moment. And that's fine. And that's good, because it's precisely that vulnerability that will be attractive to people. It shows that your treasure is elsewhere, that your perfection, while you're working towards trying to make the house as well ordered as possible materially, your perfection is not there. That's not the most important perfection. The way I like to put it is that letting somebody into your messy house is one small step towards letting somebody into your messy soul. And for me, that is the kind of vulnerability that makes the intimacy of true friendship possible.
There's a point you make in the book that I really loved, and it is a seamless garment, but just not in like the lame way. Unfortunately, it is a valid concept. Unfortunately, even the guy who coined it is pretty problematic, to use a popular word. But what I'm talking about is there's a section where you said, we're not doing the church's teaching a service in kind of like separating out moral and social teaching. Obviously, it's important to distinguish between like prudential judgment or like practical policy recommendations and principles. But let me give an example of how I've been thinking about this lately. And, I don't know whether you'll fully agree with it or not. But so I recently took it upon myself to read the classic social encyclicals. So I've read basically starting with Rerum Novarum and going through basically through John the 23rd. I've read the big encyclicals. And also I've been making a point of reading the encyclicals on marriage and the family, Casti Connubii, chief among those. And also I read the one on education, Divini Ilius Magistri. I want to say that was Leo the 13th, but maybe it was Pius the 11th. But one thing that struck me is that you can't insist on the teaching of the living wage, or the family wage, I should say, and be a feminist. Because the whole context of the family wage is the idea that one parent is working and that parent is the father, basically. The father is not the breadwinner in the sort of like sense that he isn't involved with his family other than that, or that he doesn't love being at home, but that the father is kind of the one who goes out and is chiefly the public face and representative of the family to the external world. The whole idea of the family wage is based on this, and you can't separate the two. So that was one area where I see that as connected. So I very much do see Casti Connubii as a social encyclical. And also it's just fascinating to see the rights of the family with regard to the state insisted on with like equal force as the rights of the church, for example, in the encyclical on education that I mentioned. I mean, that's a very important part. And you see where the rights of the family are being emphasized over and over again, and the father as the head of the family in encyclicals that aren't, superficially about the family, in Rerum Novarum, in the subsequent social encyclicals, in the encyclical on education. So it's fascinating to see how those are all of a piece. And if you make it all just about sort of like moral acts and behavior, like the sexual teachings or whatever, what you can and can't do in terms of sex, you miss the point that these teachings are also very much like cosmological and hierarchical in their nature. And they actually give us a picture of like the order of God's creation and of society. So that's the level on which all of those different things connect, I think.
Yeah. I mean, this is why you mentioned the seamless garment at the beginning of this, because I think prescinding from the question of the brand, what has become the brand or the catchphrase, the description is beautiful. And as I point out in the book, it's not just that the church is proposing something that holds together intellectually in some kind of abstracted academic way. The church is proposing a way of living that is comprehensive, that is integrated, that makes sense. Now, and to the extent to which we hear something about the living wage or whatever, and we're like, well, that doesn't make sense, that's impossible. That's because we've ordered the world around us such that it makes it impossible. I talk about in the book, I use this all the time, I probably use it too much, but there's the great scene at the end of The Mission, where the cardinal who has been sent to close the Jesuit missions in South America in order to preserve the position of the church with regard to the secular kings of Europe is told by one of I believe the Portuguese legate, says that we must act in the world is thus. And the cardinal says, but thus have we made the world. And that, I just think about that all the time, because it goes to what we were saying before about what the limits of the possible are. with grace, the Episcopal motto of my bishop, Bishop Zubik in Pittsburgh, is nothing is impossible with God. And I always thought, oh, that's kind of corny, but it's nice, But when you actually see like friendships form where there are major personality differences and where just things have come together that just didn't seem like it was possible before, and the kinds of just sharing of life didn't seem possible. You're like, wow, I actually see what this means now. It actually is a really, really beautiful thing to remember. Shifting that window of what's possible is essential in politics and society as well. And one of the really frustrating things is that, like you say, the living wage is thought to be impossible by different people for different reasons. One is that we're just so accustomed to the idea of the market for labor, which is the foundational to economic liberalism. But we're also conditioned by the impossibility for a lot of people of not having two incomes, or in many cases, of course, the preference of having two incomes, the apparent impossibility of having two incomes. This is before she had to disavow some of the actual thinking behind it. This is where Elizabeth Warren was quite good on the two income
and
trap.
Joe Biden.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I just saw that he's getting.
The funny thing is, it was Ivanka Trump was attacking him for having said in like the 80s or something that, there's something about the wives going to work wasn't good or something. And I was like, Trump, get your kids out of the White House, man. They're not doing any favors.
This is the realignment's like, oh, goodness. But, the church is proposing not just a shifting of policies within the order we're accustomed to. The church is proposing, even if these days in halting and tentative ways, a completely different order. And that is really intimidating, but it's also really beautiful. And I think it's also really important to insist on, because the foundations of our order are being questioned right now, and there's a lot of confusion about what it means to live in a society generally right now. And we don't do ourselves any favors by being milquetoast about the church's position on these things. We don't do ourselves any favors by adding to the confusion, by throwing in with one faction or another. And even if victory, whatever that is, in the social and political sense, is not on the horizon, I think we do ourselves the best favor we can by proposing that completely different vision, even if we're all at the moment trying to figure out what that different vision means in the 21st century. That's where all the exciting stuff's going on right now. Not where we're trying to figure out how to, tweak the marginal tax rate on X, Y, or Z, and therefore we will get distributism or something like that. That's not how it works. We are talking about proposing a completely different way of being human, one that is more in accord with the reality of humanity, not just in some sort of scientific, biological, secular sense, but in the sense of the human being as a sacred person, as a being with a natural and an inalienable relationship with God that we either recognize and grow in or ignore and let wither. And that kind of boldness, that kind of vision that we then live out the best we can given the constraints of reality as it's presented to us, that I think is where we see the real possibility of something like renewal.
Well, isn't that just a nice conclusion to this conversation? Brandon, thanks for coming on the show. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yes, thank you for having me. This was a blast.